introduce our speaker. Our speaker is Ken Church, and I know him for many years. And in the old days of speech recognition, the world was ignorant how to do it right, and we knew that idea. So we thought we'd spread the word and establish a course at MIT, and came there once a week to teach this course. And the star pupil was no one else but Ken Church. There's still another connection, because Ken Church's advisor was John Allen. And when IBM was looking for a leader to the speech recognition group in 1972, they thought of John Allen. But I think John Allen had very high requirements, financial and otherwise, so they did not come to an agreement, and they went to the second best thing to me. So I became the head of the IBM speech recognition group. So anyway, since then he's gone to... So since then, Ken has gone to bigger and better things. He's got his doctorate, he thinks, in '83. But I don't know if his memory is that good. It's so many years. So 20 years ago, and since then he has done great things, and he's still doing great things, and you're going to hear about it.
All right, well, thank you. So this is a plenary talk that I gave a couple weeks ago in Geneva at Eurospeech, and I wanted something that would appeal to a really large audience, so I thought this subject would probably do. About 10 years ago, I was asked to give an after-dinner talk called How to Cook a Demo. And it was great fun, and for an after-dinner talk, I had this message, which is, it's all theater, and don't worry about evaluation, what really matters is entertainment, and so on. Now, this plenary talk was an after-breakfast talk, and so for an after-breakfast talk, I had a slightly different message, which is be very, very careful not to set unrealistic expectations. We're going to go to the videotape, and while this is very entertaining in retrospect, many of the people you're going to see here went on to really great careers. There's a former president of MIT and current executive of Microsoft, which you probably know.
Laboratory of Electronics at MIT. Dr. Wiesner, but what really worries me today is what kind of aptitudes of machines can think, and what interests me specifically is chemistry. Well, that's a very hard question to answer. If you'd asked me that question just a few years ago, I said it was very far-fetched. Today, I just have to admit I don't really know. I suspect if you come back in 4 or 5 years, I'll say, sure, they really do things. Well, if you're confused, Doctor, how do you think I feel? We're just really beginning to understand the capabilities of computers. I've got some film to illustrate this point, which I think will amaze you. That man is playing checkers against the computer, is he? Sure, and it plays pretty well. Now, which color?
While most computer scientists saw it as a mere number cruncher, a small group thought that the digital computer had a much grander destiny. Being a general-purpose machine, it could be programmed to do things which in humans require intelligence, play games like checkers and chess, and solve brain teasers. The field became known as artificial intelligence.
Can machines really think? Even the scientists argue that. I'm convinced that machines can and will think. I don't mean that machines will behave like men. I don't think for a very long time we're going to have a difficult problem distinguishing a man from a robot. And I don't think my daughter will ever marry a computer. But I think that computers will be doing the things that men do when we say they're thinking. I'm convinced that machines can and will think in our lifetimes. I confidently expect that within a matter of 10 or 15 years, something will emerge from the laboratory which is not too far from the robot of science fiction fame.
They hadn't reckoned with ambiguity when they set out to use computers to
supercalculator, most versatile electronic brain known, translates Russian into English. Instead of mathematical wizardry, a sentence in Russian is to be fed.
One of the first non-numerical applications of computers, it was hyped as the solution to the Cold War obsession of keeping tabs on what the Russians were doing. Claims were made that the computer would replace most human translators.
At present, of course, you're just in the experimental stage. When you go in for full-scale production, what will the capacity be?
We should be able to do about, with a modern commercial computer, about 1 to 2 million words an hour. And this would be quite an adequate speed to cope with the whole output of the Soviet Union in just a few hours computer time a week.
When do you hope to be able to achieve the speed?
If our experiments go well, then perhaps within 5 years or so.
And finally, Mr. Daniel, does this mean the end of human translators?
So yes for translators of scientific and technical material, but as regards poetry and novels, no, I don't think we'll ever replace the translators of that type of material.
Mr. Daniel, thank you very much.
Right. Now I have one from my own lab here, which is a little, well...
We have been conducting research on spoken language translation. Now, this is a joint effort between AT&T Bell Laboratories and Telefónica Research and Development in Spain. The ultimate goal is to build a system which converts from English speech into Spanish speech and vice versa. Now, as you can imagine, building a complete system of this kind is very difficult. To evaluate how well we can do, build a small prototype experimental system. This system, called VEST for Voice English Spanish Translator, translates sentences that relate to currency exchange and banking. The prototype has a vocabulary of only 400 words, but it is fast and easy to use. There are 5 main components to the system we will be showing. A model which describes the language specification, a speech recognition system which takes spoken input and converts it into text, a language analysis system which takes text and produces an analysis for a sentence, a translation system which takes that analysis and outputs a sentence in the target language, and finally a pair of voice synthesizers, one for English and one for Spanish. Hello, I'd like to buy pesetas. Necesito alguna forma de identificación.
I need some form of identification.
Here's my passport. What is the exchange rate between US dollars and pesetas? La tasa de cambio es de 101 pesetas por dólar.
The exchange rate is 101 pesetas to the dollar.
Y la comisión es del 2%.
And the commission is 2%.
I'd like 8,500 pesetas. 8.500 pesetas con la comisión del 2% son 87 dólares.
8,500 pesetas with the commission of 2% comes to $87.
Here's $87. Aquí tiene su dinero.
Here is your money.
Y aquí tiene su pasaporte.
And here is your passport.
Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Adiós.
Goodbye.
Okay. Now, let's see. Pierre Isabelle, who was the organizer of that after-dinner talk that I gave, said he had a similar demo and he had to pull it because it was so effective he couldn't explain to the powers that be what was wrong with it, why it wasn't just on the verge of solving everything. And the limitations of technology are easy to, well understood in the research community, but very, very difficult to explain to the general community. And so that kind of demo can lead to a success catastrophe. Now I want to give another one here. Yeah, I know this. Yeah. This is like a joke where half the audience knows the punchlines.
You ever yelled at your computer? I suspect you have. What would you do if one day the computer yelled back at you, bit of an exaggeration perhaps, but this morning you're going to get a first look really, at a computer that actually responds to the human voice and can talk back.
Coming up next, a conversation with Casper. That's me.
Right now, 18 minutes after, fans of sci-fi well remember Hal the Talking Computer from the film 2001. Well, reality is closer to science fiction with Apple Computer's new developed program that allows its computers to understand and respond to spoken commands. And for our first look at this new technology, joining us are John Scully, the Chief Executive Officer of Apple, and Kai-Fu Lee, the inventor of Apple's speech recognition technology, and also with us this morning, Casper the computer. Nice to have all three of you here. Now, some people might say, Mr. Scully, come on, there are other computers that do recognize voices, and I think even synthesize voices, but how's Casper different?
Well, John, this is the first time we've had a computer that can handle continuous speech the way we're having a conversation now. It's also speaker independent, which means it can recognize you or me or Kai-Fu or anyone else.
You have to train it for it to one.
And it works on a personal computer. This happens to be a Macintosh we're running it on.
That's kind of amazing. How does it do that?
Well, there are two breakthroughs in here. One is speaker independence, which means we train it on thousands of speakers, so it learns what English sounds like from a variety of speakers. And secondly, we have enabled it to recognize continuous speech from 1 trillion sentences.
1 trillion different sentences?
Yes.
All right, now we're going to give you, go ahead and turn it on. We're going to give a little demonstration. I should point out too, though, that this is not available yet. This is a prototype, and it will be available in, what, a year or two?
In several years, we think we can turn this technology into products.
All right. Casper, good morning.
Good morning, America. And good morning, Joan.
Go ahead.
Casper, copy this to make right 2. Casper, paste. Casper, select all. Casper, 18-point bold. Casper, word underline. Casper, 72-point italic outline.
Casper, open checking. Casper, pay Macy's $65. Casper, pay Pacific Bell $95.18.
Casper, program my VCR. Casper, record channel 5 from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. tonight. Casper, accept program. Casper, accept program.
Casper, accept program.
Casper, record Good Morning America this Wednesday. Casper, accept program.
Casper, open my calendar. Casper, schedule a meeting with Bob Strong.
What day would you like to meet?
Casper, show this Wednesday. Casper, show this Wednesday.
At what time would you like to schedule the meeting?
Casper, from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m.
The meeting with Bob Strong is scheduled for 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
Thank you, Casper.
Well, I mean, I must say that's pretty amazing, isn't it? Okay, this is interesting because we're calling it a talking computer, but what I think is so fascinating is that it's actually a listening computer. Is that kind of fair to say?
Well, that's true, Joe. And I think when you realize that only about 25% of the people use computers all the time, this will open up, when it becomes a product, the opportunity for many people to be able to carry a computer around in their pocket or use it on a personal computer to do things that they would do in their normal life.
Because instead of being intimidating, it's almost going to be like a friend, right?
Well, it's a whole new metaphor for computing, which is a conversational metaphor.
Is it also an all-new software? Is it going to be like a software that's going to adapt to other computers, or something totally built into it?
Well, this is
What day would you like to meet?
Oh, you're out of time, so people are just going to have to find that out when they go to buy it. Really interesting. One heck of an invention, thank you. We'll be back.
Let me say something here.
Right.
This, of course, was watched by the executives at IBM. And the next morning was just a complete catastrophe because they called me up and why can't we do this? All right, and why don't we? They have invested $100 million into us at IBM, into our group, and here it is, and Apple can do it, and we can't do it.
All right. So let me give you the perspective from AT&T. the very day that that happened, we put speech recognition at scale into the network. All right, it wasn't big sexy stuff. It was like isolated word, collect, make a collect call, and so on. All right, that had significant bottom line impact, enough to justify, according to Larry Rabiner, all the work we'd ever done, all right, and would ever do. But of course, the media wasn't interested either. So you know, there is something to. I now work with some of the guys who used to sell sugar water, and they know something. Okay, they know how to get media attention. But anyway, this was here about, I mean, there's a couple of points here. One is how to do a demo, right? And I think they, you know, the guys who sell sugar water know something that you and I don't know, all right? But on the other hand, there's a risk in giving a demo, right? Just in case we haven't got the message about expectations. Oh gosh, where's my cursor? There it is. Yeah. All right.
Tonight, Andy Rooney on the phone. In the last few years, there have been some changes in the way we use the telephone, and there are sounds now that are even worse than those busy signals. Half the time, your call isn't even answered by a real live person. It's answered by a machine.
Thank you for calling WordPerfect Corporation. This is not a technical support number. If you need further assistance, please stay on the line and the next available...
No one wants to talk to a machine. There's one thing even more irritating than a recorded voice. That's when they put you on hold and then pipe music in that you don't want to hear.
Please wait, and the next available agent will be with you momentarily.
And where do they get these zombies who give those canned messages? They must have put an ad in the paper looking for people who say hello especially well.
Hello, 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 hello. This is a recording.
Remember when you used to call the airline and tell them where you wanted to go?
Thank you for calling American Airlines. Please make your selection from the following menu at any time. For assistance with flight arrival, departure, and gate information, press 1. For assistance from a tour specialist, press 5.
Now after calling an airline, you want to tell them where they can go. I often commute into New York City by train, and sometimes I want to know what time the next train leaves.
Welcome to Metro North Commuter Railroad. If you are using a touch-tone telephone and wish to use our automated information system, press 1 now. Thank you. To continue, please push 1 now. If you know which buttons to push, there's no need to listen to the end of each message.
I can walk home at the time it takes me to get that information. Maybe you live in Washington, D.C. You've got a hot tip to give your favorite CBS News reporter there. You look up the CBS number in the phone book, dial it. Here's what you get.
Thank you for calling the CBS News Washington Bureau. To reach a CBS News correspondent, press 4. To reach the Washington News Desk, press 5. To reach the CBS Radio Division, press 6. For all other divisions, press 8. If you need further assistance, press 9.
Some go-getter news operation, isn't it?
All right. So let's get on with the main topic of the talk. Where have we been and where are we going? And I'm going to give 3 answers which more or less cover the bases. The first one is consistent progress over decades. And this should help with managing expectations. So Charles Wayne has been advocating this consistent progress over time. And I'm going to say it was very controversial 20 years ago, and these days I think it's pretty much accepted practice. There's still some grumbling if you listen in the halls. Now there's some benefits and some risks, and I'm going to say the benefits and the risks are largely the same. So the benefit is that there's agreement on what to do. The risk is that all our eggs in one basket. And similarly, it limits endless discussion, which means there isn't enough discussion. And it clearly helps sell the field and manage expectations, helps with fundraising. But the flip side of that is that the methodology could become very burdensome. And as we'll see in the 50s, one of the reasons that empiricism lost its position was because the methodology became burdensome. Now, I want to contrast Charles Wayne's view with Bob Lucky's hockey stick business case. So on the x-axis I have time, and on the y-axis we have money. I don't care whether it's top line revenue or bottom line profits or whatever. What I want to, the idea of the hockey stick is, well, last year we didn't do much, and this year we didn't do much, but next year is going to be great, right? Now, an improvement to this is that I'm going to label the axes with the indexicals, and then I never have to do the slide again. All right. So so the ideal answer to the question, where have we been and where are we going, I think is Moore's Law. It gives you a nice argument for how you can use the past to predict the future. And Moore's Law is originally stated that every 18 months you get twice as much for half. And that had to do with Gordon Moore noticing something about density of transistors on wafers. And that's great, but what we observe is that the slopes aren't all the same, that some things double in 10 years and some things double in less than a year. So I'm going to refer to the things that double every 10 years as sort of normal inflation. That's like putting your money in the bank, and 10 years later you get twice as much. We can kind of get used to that. And then I'll talk the stuff at the top I'll call hyperinflation, where every year you turn around you got twice as much. Now normally, in Moore's Law, we don't think of inflation as a bad thing. Normally, it's a good thing that we get twice as much in so little. But I'm going to argue, in fact, that inflationary pressures are a little frightening, and that having hyperinflation is not necessarily a good thing. Now, within that, there are different mechanisms that drive the slopes at different rates. And I'll talk about two mechanisms in particular. There's physics and there's investment. And I'm going to suggest that these kinds of things drive the rate of progress in speech and language and everything else that we know and love. By physics, an example of what I have in mind is that the difference between disk seek and disk capacity. Disk seek doubles every 10 years, whereas disk capacities double every year. And the difference is that disk seeks, you're up against physical problems. You have to move things around, and that's really hard. And I'm going to argue that there's progress in that area, but it's not going to be real easy. Whereas disk capacities, at least for the next decade or so, people think that's probably not limited as much by physics. There are physical properties that are rumored that they'll come in after 10 years. But for the next 10 years or so, it looks like you can expect this kind of rate of progress to continue. Now, as an example of investment, I want to compare and contrast PCs and Cray computers. PCs improved faster than Crays because they had a larger market. The larger market meant they had more money for R&D, and there with more money in R&D, they got better faster. A friend of mine, Danny Hillis, who was a classmate of mine, and we were working at Thinking Machines, he kind of coined this phrase of a diseconomy of scale, that computing was better, cheaper, and faster on smaller computers. How is it that a PC was not only cheaper than a supercomputer, but it was better than a supercomputer? And the same is true about routers, that a LAN router, a cheap router, will outperform a big telephone switch. All right? And the argument is that an economist would tell me that economies of scale depend on the size of the market, not the size of the computer. So that a PC has a bigger market than a big iron. So a PC from an economist's view is bigger than a supercomputer. From a computer scientist's point of view, we might think of the supercomputer being bigger than the PC. Now, I'm going to be looking for examples of Moore's Law in speech and language. And here's a slide that I borrowed from Rich Cox, which is supposed to tell us about progress in speech coding over a couple of decades. And he has some examples here.
The speaker read his talk verbatim without ever looking up. Either he had never learned to read properly, or, giving him the benefit of the doubt, he could not see his manuscript in the dim light.
In any event, he affected a combination of inaudibility and incomprehensibility. There seemed an infinity of slides as he droned on and on. None of it, and I mean none of it, made any sense. There seemed an infinity of slides as he droned on and on. None of it, and I mean none of it, made any sense. One of those moments of great clarity came to me when I felt I was the only person alive in the room. We aren't really actually going through this charade, I thought. Finally the speaker said, "Last slide, please." After a long pause, the voice of the projectionist came from the rear of the room. "The other one was the last slide," he said.
No. So this slide is more complicated than Moore's Law. There's lots of dimensions going on. We have bit rate, quality, complexity, delay. There's a ceiling that's imposed up here, which is, you really can't do better than that because that has to do with the telephone standards. And it was easy to reach that ceiling. But down in this region, you can see that we're kind of getting, we're cutting the bit rates by a factor of 2 every decade or so in the low bit range. And this is relatively slow by Moore's Law standards. It's not hyperinflation, it's more like normal inflation. And the performance, it's like disk seeks. It's limited more by the physics than investment. And the potential opportunity here, it looks like, is that you can imagine maybe an order of magnitude improvement and a doubling every decade. We got a couple of decades to get there. So, you know, maybe we could get to 1 kilobit per second or so. Now, Roger Moore, who's no relation to Gordon Moore, in private conversations was estimating that their entropy here is about 50 bits per second. That is, there's about 25 bits per second of, if you were to translate it to text. And another 25 bits per second would tell you who the speaker is and the prosody. So, you know, there's quite a bit of room to improve from 1 kilobit to 50. But of course, the 1 kilobit seems eminently doable, and nobody has a clue as to how to get to 50. Now, I'm going to compare the speech rates to text rates and say that speech rates are around 2 kilobits per second, say, and text is around 2 bits per character. And I figure there's a couple orders of magnitude gap between speech rates and text rates. And I don't expect speech compression to close that gap in the foreseeable future. So now let me talk about reducing error rates. Here's a slide that I borrowed from NIST, which shows basically a whole bunch of error rate reductions over a 15-year period of various shared bake-offs. I won't go through any of them, but let me suggest that from all this, it looks like there's there's a reduction of around a factor of 10 per decade, and that this work seems to be limited more by the R&D investment. I don't see physics as playing a role here right now. Now, here's another argument from another slide that I borrowed showing 40 years of progress in speech compression, in speech coding, speech understanding. I won't go through any of these, but one of the issues I have here is that while it makes a good argument for consistent improvement over time, it's unlike Moore's Law. It's very difficult to use this to predict what's going to happen. So for what's going to happen, I went on the web and I found another set of predictions that kind of look like the second half of this slide, the last slide, which were some suggestions from a European ELSNet roadmap conference about where people would be in the next 10 years or so. And I won't go through those either, but let me try to put all of that into some overview and say that the question is, where have we been and where are we going? And the first third of this talk is going to talk about arguments for consistent progress over time. And then I've separated some of the arguments on the left from the ones on the right. And the ones on the left are where you can use the argument to forecast where we're going to be, whereas the ones on the right don't help you so much in that, either because they don't say anything about where we're going or because the extrapolation is inappropriate, as in the case of the hockey stick. And one of the nice things, not only about being able to forecast the future, is that we can then also start to make suggestions about what the mechanisms are that are driving these slopes. And you could say which of these things are limited by physics and which are limited by investment. And then you might do different things to support the different fields depending on what the issues are. Now, I'm going to try to cover all the bases. So I started off with the simple case of consistent progress over time. I'm going to then go into periodic signals, and then we'll get into aperiodic signals. And between all three, I should have all the bases covered. Right? So I'm making lots of predictions or no predictions. Now, it has been said that a lot of the recent progress was made possible by the revival of empiricism. And Fred's clearly been very influential here, and I've made some efforts to help the revival of empiricism myself. But I still get nervous when the claims are made that it was because of this revival that all this progress has been made possible. I won't go through all that, but let me just mention, of course, that the revival was a revival of something. And what was back there in the 50s was very empirical, that empiricism dominated everything from psychology to electrical engineering. And I won't go through all the details there either. But in between that, there was a rationalist period when people like Chomsky and Minsky, many people who were influential when I was at MIT, had made a fairly strong case against what was in vogue when their teachers were at their peak. And I'm going to argue here that if you extrapolate from this, that rationalism should be back in vogue in 10 years or so. And the argument is, well, of course, periodic signals are continuous and they support extrapolation. And you can question whether the extrapolation is appropriate or not. And I can offline go through why I believe this is coming. I'm not saying I advocate it, I'm just saying I believe it's coming. And you can question whether the claim that it's because of this empiricist revival that all this progress has come along. Now, 10 years after I gave that talk, How to Cook a Demo, they invited me back and asked me, I think they really wanted Mercer, but they couldn't have him. I gather you guys have asked to have Mercer too, but you can't have him either. So I'm the stand-in, right, just as you were the stand-in for him, right? And they asked me, since I was the token empiricist, they asked me, what, if anything, had happened in the last 10 years? You know, you've heard about all this statistical MT mumbo-jumbo. This was an MT conference where they didn't particularly like it then. They would love to think that it went away. So I was supposed to argue that something had happened. The argument I came up with, which worked well enough there, is that too much had happened. All right? That it's now to the point where you can't publish a paper without an evaluation. I worry that the pendulum has swung so far that we're no longer training students for the possibility that the pendulum might swing back the other way. So we ought to be preparing students for the possibility that we're right, and we ought to be preparing students for the possibility that we're wrong. So here I'm arguing that history repeats itself, and the question might be, what's the mechanism? And I actually find very insightful something that Mark Twain is said to have said. He's said to have said many things, but he said that grandparents and grandchildren have a natural alliance. They have a common enemy. So I expect that the next generation will rebel against us, just as we did onto them, and they did onto the other guys. You can go through, and this is a chart that Mercer and I published together 10 years ago, about what some of the people who were advocates of rationalism did and what some of the people who were advocates of empiricism did. And I think they were kind of talking past one another. They're both sensible positions. They're just different positions addressing different problems with different techniques. And I won't go through all this. One of my former colleagues at AT&T likes to go over whenever people think of me as a rabid empiricist. they remember that, of course, when I was at MIT, it wasn't like that, and you probably remember, right? And of course, when I moved to Bell Labs, I finally learned better. They didn't teach these things at MIT. But one of the early things I worked on was letter to sound rules. This is a video, but it really has no video.
I am a system for real-time translation of unrestricted text.
This is 20 years.
Speech, developed in the Information Principles Research Laboratory at AT&T Bell Labs. My input is ordinary text, and my output is the kind of speech that you are hearing now. My inventors think that my word pronunciation and intelligibility are the best around. I can pronounce proper names of many nationalities correctly. For instance, Nakatami, Uchidi, Rosenthal, Trudeau, Caliban, Sun, Gonzalez, Gorbachev, Yeltsin. You're going to hear...
So there was a little bit of net talk there. I won't go through that. So the statistics here were that you use the letter statistics to try to guess the etymology, and you use that to determine the letter to sound rules. Soon after that, we started using dictionaries, and it was a huge deal to get people to buy a 1/4 megabyte of memory to go on the synthesizer. That was a big deal. Buying a dictionary was no big deal. And case-based reasoning, the best inference is table lookup. Then I did some work on part-of-speech tagging, and then soon after that, Patrick Hanks, who was a lexicographer at that time with Collins, spent a month visiting, and that sort of came out of buying the dictionary. And then we started working on these collocations, things like strong tea versus, well, you change the example to powerful drugs. Why do you use strong in one case and powerful in the other? And other similar kinds of problems are bread and butter, doctor, nurse. There are patterns here that were not well modeled in any of the parsers in those days. I don't know if they're better nowadays. And so the thing was that the work in corpus lexicography in the 80s was very empirical. They looked at a lot of data, but they didn't use a lot of statistics. And we took some very obvious sort of statistical notions, things like if you want to find a pattern like doctor and nurse, look for things that co-occur together much more than chance, and show those things to the lexicographer. And that really changed a lot of the way they worked. Then it sort of led naturally to other problems like how to estimate the probability of things you haven't seen, and the good Turing smoothing is sort of a nice example of that. I currently have David Poole in my department, who's one of the experts in counting whales. And you might ask, why would you want to have people counting whales in a phone company? Well, it turns out counting whales isn't all that different from counting customers. And you're dealing with cases where you haven't seen much. All right. Anyway, the plot up here in the top is the Microsoft manuals, a bunch of different chapters in a bunch of different languages, and it's using techniques that are used in biology for trying to do dot plots of different gene sequences in order to figure out which of these pairs of files is in the same language and which pair of files is about the same chapter. And maybe in there you can see the difference between squares and diagonals. I doubt it, but word sense disambiguation sort of clearly grows out of alignment. And then I get back to something that would be relevant to that machine translation conference, which is even if the IBM approach to machine translation doesn't solve all the problems for machine translation, it still produced lots of tools and techniques and academic contributions that have influence across many of the things that I described. And I think, in fact, this is probably going to be the legacy. So the question is, what have they done recently? Well, that's quite a list. This is a slide I didn't have the nerve to show in Geneva. All right. At any rate, basically, the noisy channel model is that you have some input going in and you get some output, and you get to observe the output and you want to try to figure out what the inputs were. And this basically has two terms. There's the prior or the language model, and that basically it's hard to beat the trigram model, and the trigram and the language model is application independent. For the channel model, it depends a lot on the application. So for speech recognition, writer and rider, at least in my dialect, are very confusable. In OCR, there are different confusions. L and 1 are confusable. And in spelling correction, government with and without an N are confusable. And you can estimate these channel model confusions from a different mechanism. In the case of spelling correction, for example, the AP News generates 2,000 typos a month or week, I believe it was, that we can find. They claim the Wall Street Journal doesn't have any typos, but we found the typo rate in the Wall Street Journal was 1/3 of what it is in the AP News. It's better than the AP News, but it isn't zero. Right. At the end of the year, they always publish the typos they found, and they hardly ever find any. Anyway, here's the slide I wouldn't show in Geneva. So a lot of these techniques started in the speech field and then moved into language. This model makes a lot of sense in the speech area. In optical character recognition, it seems reasonably plausible. Spelling correction, that's okay, but I think as Fred pointed out, this is perhaps a better model for the finger typos than when you don't know how to spell a word. But you can use it in either case. And then for part of speech tagging, now this is pretty weird. The idea is that people actually think in terms of parts of speech, but for some reason that we don't understand, they come out corrupted as words. And your job is to get rid of this corruption and get back to the essence of what they were thinking. Right? Well, all right, it works. And now for machine translation, here's a model that would be made in America where, basically the francophones think in English. They don't know it, but they do. And
when I taught this in France, I switched the two.
Yeah, right. I think Descartes actually did it that way, and you could get away with it. All right. So now we've gone from continuous improvement to periodic oscillation to aperiodic, and we've got the bases covered. Now by aperiodic, I mean some kind of fundamental change that invalidates basic fundamental assumptions that we know and love, and therefore the predictions are no longer valid. I'm going to give one example. I didn't really invent this example. I didn't invent anything here. But this is an argument I saw from Jim Gray on the web, where what's going to happen when petabytes go from $2 million to $2,000. For Moore's Law, it doesn't, nobody seems all that shocked when I say, or when Jim Gray says, that petabytes cost $2 million today, but they'll be $2,000 in not very long, 10 years in the future from a while ago, right? And
10 to the what power?
15. 15. Yeah. All right. So can demand keep up? And if not, revenues will collapse, and the whole field, everything we know in computing, telecommunications, and everything else will just go away. It'll be like watches, right? That there's no money to be made in watches, well, maybe in jewelry, but not in things that keep time, because anyone can buy a watch for nothing, and there's only so much demand. So I've got two answers basically covering the bases. Either it's no problem or it's a big problem. The no problem is demand has always kept up. The pundits have never been able to explain it, and here's a quote from Watson's father that's often used, saying that there may be demand for 5 computers. The big problem is that demand is everything. Anyone, even a .com, can build a telephone network or whatever. The challenge is to sell it. And what you need is a killer application that will put more minutes on the network. This is an AT&T-centric view of the problem, but you get the gist. So the question that I get from my executives is, how do you explain to a lay audience what is a petabyte? All right? The answer I gave you isn't going to fly, and why everyone's going to buy them. All right? All right? Now, so let me give a wrong answers. One is 10 to the million is of you know, 10 to the 6th of the million, that's a floppy disk or an email message. We know what that is. 10 to the 9th is a billion, you know, a billion here, a billion there, and soon you're talking real money. 10 to the 12th, that's a trillion. That's the U.S. debt. We can kind of relate to that, right? And 10 to the 15th is a gazillion, all right? And a gazillion, when I was growing up, was synonymous with infinity. It was an unimaginably large number, all right? So let me give some more wrong answers about what's a petabyte. So the goal here is to create demand for a petabyte per lifetime. And so that's 10 to the 15 bytes per 100 years, which I estimate is 18 megabytes per minute while you're awake and while you're sleeping, right? And that would be about 18,000 pages a minute for your life, okay? So this is your homework assignment. You have to read 18,000 pages for the rest of your life per minute, okay? Now, if it's speech, it would be 317 simultaneous telephone calls. All right, so think of it right now that you're going crazy with your cell phone growing at the same time that I've got 3 telephone lines at work and I've got an answering machine at home. Well, now I'm up to 4 lines, all right? And they don't go around the clock. The ones at work don't tend to ring all night long. So text won't do it, and speech probably won't either, but at least it's a step in the right direction. A DVD video of your life would do it. That is, it would be basically for your entire life is about a petabyte per lifetime if you lived 100 years. The problem, of course, is that it's too easy to compress DVD. You can save an order of magnitude pretty easily without too much distortion. And the phone companies had some experience trying to sell picture phone. And it turns out that there hasn't really been that much demand for it. At least in the 50s there wasn't. And there's also some concerns about privacy. There seem to be some times in your life where you want to pull the curtains. So it's not clear that everybody wants a DVD video of their life. And now, one thing I do want to argue here is I want to bank on speech recognition not working too well. And we can't afford improvements in compression either too much. I don't want speech rates to come down to text rates. That would only make the problem harder. The problem is how to consume space, not how to get, right? Okay? All right. Now, fortunately, I don't have a problem in that direction. All right. Now, when I gave this slide in Geneva, some people said I was really beating a dead horse. But I'm going to say that the old problem was dictation, and it's going to have to give rise to a new problem. I'm going to think of search as having a better opportunity for consuming space than dictation. All right. So the new priorities are that we're trying to increase demand for space. We're not trying to get rid of space. We're not worried about data entry. We're worried about how to create a lot more demand for linguistic material, text, speech, video, than people could ever look at. All right? So if you had the ability to search over a large amount of stuff, then you could find the good stuff when you want it, and therefore you'd be willing to pay for both the good and the bad, because you never know what's going to be good until later. So the argument is the new killer app is going to be search, not dictation, and something like a speech Google, where you can find anything that's ever been said or anything that's ever been written or anything that's ever been videotaped. Another, I shouldn't use the data mining word, I'm told, anymore, but the idea is that there's a lot of speech out there, and if you could learn any intelligence from all that speech, there ought to be some value there. So the intelligence is value, but transcription is not value. Transcription is a means towards an end, but not an end. Now, the old priorities, when I want to, all right, I'm going to go a little bit overboard. Just bear with me for a minute here. Dictation, I find that I actually have to explain to people these days what a dictation machine is. They don't know, all right? Dictation application dates back to the days when people knew what a dictation machine was, all right? All right? Speech recognition has not displaced typing. All right, speech recognition has gotten better, but typing skills have gotten better faster. All right, so the Moore's Law constant on typing skills for people is better than the Moore's Law constant for speech recognition. My son is going to learn typing in 1st grade. And my secretary, I'm impressed that she knows how to take dictation, but she never does it. All right? And I don't even think they're going to teach it in secretarial school much longer. So dictation machines are history. My son will probably never see one, and it'll probably never even show up in a museum. Museums have slide rulers, they have steam trains, but dictation machines, they're not even cool. Right? Now, Data mining. This is a blurb from a trade magazine, but the idea is that lots of call centers are out there. They're recording a lot of speech. If you could learn from all that speech going through all those call centers some business intelligence, that would be worth something. And that's a top-line argument. That would improve revenues. Mostly people have been worrying about bottom-line problems like how to reduce cost, how to do routing or something. That's not the problem. The problem is how to learn something of value that the business needs to know. And I think people are beginning to discover that. So here's a bunch of slides that I borrowed from Jim Gray that more or less say what I've been saying. So here it says that petabytes are coming. They're going to be $2 million. I mean, they were $2 million today, but they're going to be 2,000 soon. That the only thing he could think of that would possibly consume this amount of space is video. Nothing else can get you into the range of a petabyte per lifetime. Then he started looking around and seeing who's using a lot of space. Yahoo has a good fraction of a petabyte, but the per capita demand is zilch. All right, it doesn't matter. And the cost here is not in the disks; it's all in the people. But they'll fix that. AOL, same story. They also have maybe a petabyte, and the per capita demand again is zilch. Google, same story. Per capita demand is zilch, and again, the cost is totally in people. They have another paper called Digital Immortality where they try to estimate the lifetime demands for different amounts of space. And the thing that's sort of noticeable here is that the only thing that consumes any sizable amount of space is video. Nothing else will do it, and it's got to be high quality video to do it. Nothing else would get you, would consume this.
Well, we might go more than video at some point and have molecular scans or something.
Well, okay, you can increase.
I don't understand this idea of the video. That means that, are they saying that I would want to have...
No. We're saying that the only thing we could, if you extrapolated how much email or text that you would sort of consume in your lifetime, they're coming up with numbers like 15 gigabytes per lifetime.
But
now,
I'll keep erasing it, of course. So
well, maybe you're, but if it didn't cost you anything, you might not. Yeah.
I just can't stand it.
But reps want to keep a whole lot more than they will ever consume. You want to be able to search orders not even more than you ever want to access.
Yeah. Well, I think the younger people here might actually, they might get used to consuming this amount of space. Yeah, there are differences here, that is, some of us are pack
So the
rats.
video would be what? What would I...
If you kept an entire channel of video for your entire lifetime.
What would it be? I mean, what would it contain?
Me, right?
There's this graduate student at MIT who just walked around with a camera on his head. All right, and you can imagine if everyone did that, you would kind of, and it was DVD quality.
I don't even look at any good movies.
Right. So look, the problem is that I'm stretching here and I can't do it. Right. I can't seem to. All right, you're not helping me. Right. So we better go find something useful to go do with ourselves.
But again, I think a point is that if you could make whatever Fred decided to keep, you could search it usefully, then he might be willing to keep it.
That's the only argument I can come up with.
There's another angle on this, though. You're looking at this as per capita. But
Yeah.
the power of all this stuff is aggregating information.
Right.
The power of this is aggregating it over lots and lots of people. The question is whether everybody needs their own copy of it. So
Yeah. That is Google.
if you're going to have a network,
Well,
you don't
well,
only
then
have
they
a copy,
come-
you don't have a space.
Yeah.
All
Well,
right.
to keep the person copies, you look at the storage cost versus the bandwidth transmission cost using a central repository. So it might make more sense to have personal copies.
Right.
All right. So I'm going to say the future of everything we know and love depends on supply running into a physical limit. All right. Something like Moore's Law stopping tomorrow. All right. And nobody making any progress on compression. I don't think that's likely. All right. It could also be that demand would keep up. I'm not optimistic. And that if we build it, they will come, perhaps. but I tend to think these pundits are pretty good. Maybe the fat lady will sing. Or we would make big progress on searching big stuff. And that's, I think, our best bet. And this is an argument for how we could justify everything we know and love and keep busy for a little while. Now, I'm going to switch a little bit to what I call a bait and switch strategy. So the bait is the public internet. Everybody talks about that as being the goal. I'm saying no, no, no. Those are the free samples. All right? That's sort of like the drug pusher giving you free samples, but the real stuff is coming. All right? The internet is large, sexy, available, and has all this interesting structure. But the switch is that as large as it is, there are larger and more valuable things out there. I'm thinking of private intranets and the local disks on everybody's laptops and the telephone networks. The exclusivity produces value, that nobody cares about data that everyone else can have, all right? And it's just like Groucho Marx, nobody wants to be in a club that would have him. All right, he doesn't want to be in a club that would have him, all right? So the strategy is to use the public internet to develop, test, and socialize new ways to get value from large linguistic repositories. But the value to society is to port those solutions to private data sources. All right. So now let's talk about how big things are. People talk about the web as being the biggest thing there ever was. All right. And it's large, I'll agree with that. It's rich, and it's got interesting structure, and mostly it's available. All right. Now, when you want to talk about how big it is, I said that the pundits out there said it was a petabyte. Now I'm going to argue it's puny. All right? If you look at n-gram statistics on Google and you compare them to the British National Corpus, you'll see that there's 3 orders of magnitude difference between Google and the British National Corpus. All right? And by this argument, we know the British National Corpus is 100 million words, so that means Google is 100 billion words. At 100 billion words, that makes it only a terabyte, far from a petabyte. All right? Now, of course, maybe what Jim Gray was talking about is how much disk space the company owns and how inefficient they are in using it. But if you were clever and you knew what they were doing, you ought to be able to do it at merely a terabyte, which means everything Google has would probably fit on a PC, probably today. All right, a single PC. All right, and everyone can have their own copy if they wanted it. It's no big whoop. It will not consume the next crank of Moore's Law on all the disks. It's often said that the web is the largest thing out there, but we know that if you changed copyright laws, you could release a lot more. But that's puny compared to the private intranets and the telephone networks. According to the FCC trends, which these slides are on the web and the paper's on the web and it's all in the proceedings, you can easily find it. And I have the reference there. But basically, there's 1 telephone line per person in the US, and each line is used for an hour a day. And if you assume various other things, that comes to 10 Google collections per day, if you could record it all. And currently, the data networks are bigger than, about the same as voice, but data is growing faster than voice. And AT&T ships around a petabyte per day, and we figure that in our market we have about 10% of what there is. So there's tens of petabytes worldwide per day, and that's only on wide area networks. If you looked at the sort of local loop, it'd be much more. Or so it's a lot of speech, but it's not petabytes per capita. So in Europe, you have to be very careful about privacy. I'm going to argue just the flip side of it, that it's exclusivity that produces value. The data on the private networks can't be distributed, and most of the pardon me. Yeah, right. This is, maybe that shut it up. Anyway, most of the data on the private networks can't be distributed, and most of the telephone conversations can't be recorded, let alone distributed. But attitudes are changing. It used to be considered rude to have an answering machine. Now it's rude not to have one. All right? All right? And between answering machines and call centers, I figure about 10% of what we have could be recorded. Maybe not by us, but by somebody. And that would come to worldwide about a petabyte per day. So, and I should say that when I listen to calls and customer calls for quality purposes, right, the customers clearly exhibit an expectation that we could retrieve previous calls based on the content of the previous calls. All right. Now we don't have that technology. All right. But that's the expectation. And I'm suggesting that new capabilities will produce new public policy. So, for example, with video recording, it's now expected that you would have it in some places and prohibited in others. But even in the places where it's prohibited, there are interesting challenges going on. So it would be scandalous. So in the past, recording all this would have been prohibitively expensive. But thanks to Moore's Law, the prices are falling and will continue. Even at current prices, transport is much more expensive than storage and will continue to be so forever, I believe. That the retail prices, or the transport, is about 5 cents per minute for consumer retail. And for disk storage, the same minute of speech is about ½ cent per minute to store it forever. All right. And so if I'm going to pay for the long distance call, I might as well keep it forever, if there were any value in doing so. Similar comments hold for web pages. If I'm willing to pay to fetch a web page from over some wide area network, I might as well cache it forever. All right? And why would I flush a page if there's any chance I would ever use it again? And I'm going to argue that a web cache is very similar. Is very similar to a crawler. A crawler is a look-ahead cache. It's go find the pages I might request and keep them forever. Storage is cheap compared to transport. So back in 10 years ago when Mercer was talking about, get more data and don't worry about balancing, this was fairly scandalous stuff. 10 years later, when Eric Brill says the same thing, we all agree. And many researchers are finding that performance improves with corpus size over the full range of sizes they can look at. And the best paper award in EMNLP a year ago was sort of on this topic, at least the way I spin it, which is that for many tasks ranging from predicting psycholinguistic judgments to language modeling for speech, that larger corpora like Google are better than tiny corpora like the British National Corpus. It's hard to talk about that as tiny, but it is. Google is displacing the British National Corpus the same way that PCs are displacing Crays. The argument is that the larger market share that Google has compared to the British National Corpus means that Google has more money for R&D, which means that they have a better Moore's Law time constant. And so there's no way that public funding can keep up with Google at doing what Google's doing.
Is British National Corpus annotated?
Is it? No, I don't think so.
Possibly annotated.
Well, some of it is. Okay, so there's some, there's some places where it might be able to contribute. All right, but if they were competing at doing the same thing, you don't want to use public money to compete to try to support something where the market forces are just going to do it in. So the government used to try to support supercomputers, but even they couldn't do it. All right. Now, I don't mean that they shouldn't support public linguistic repositories, but they need to find a niche that the private sector isn't going to do. So now, another spin I would take of this paper, and somewhat the whole genre, is that collecting more data is better than tricks for not collecting data. So smoothing, balance, these are all tricks for not collecting data. All right? Right? Now, you still find papers even at Eurospeech on tiny corpora. I mean, not only tiny like British National Corpus. I mean, you find things on a million words here or less. Now, the tricks have limited power, so it'd be interesting to ask. What I mean is that if you did some kind of trick like balancing or something, that's probably equivalent to collecting somewhat more data without the tricks. And you'd like to be able to measure in the statistical notion of power how much the benefit of the trick is and how much the trick costs. All right? And I'd like to see more papers measuring this trade-off. So now, was balancing the British National Corpus worth the effort? And of course, there was an Oxford debate on this question 10 years ago. And you know how Oxford debates work, which is whichever position the House is predisposed to vote against, they all vote for. And so they all agreed that no, a corpus shouldn't be balanced, which meant they all thought that it should. But they were right, even though, you know what I'm saying, right? That is, right. Now, the rising tide of data will lift all boats, and I'll give two examples of this. In the Trek question answering, they have the standard bake-off where they ask questions like, what's the highest point on Earth? And I'm going to give a kind of controversial answer, but it seems that some people, Eric Brill among them, are saying that what you do is you stick the question as is into a search engine, and the answer is on the first page. All right? And Eric wasn't the only one to point this out. We had an invited talk from Google where the head of R&D used exactly this example.
Excuse me, I don't understand it. What's the point of this is a
So there's a standard bake-off question, which is what's the highest point on Earth? And they have all these computational linguists trying to answer this using writing tools to do it. And one of the best competing methods, we can argue whether it's the best or not, is just take the question as is, stick it in Google or anything like that, and the answer to the question is on the first page. And in this case, it is. All right? All right? And nobody really has something that works a whole lot better than that. All right? And the argument here is that getting more data will just make this work better. And now, another thing that we like to do with large data sources is to try to acquire lexical resources, dictionaries, ontologies, word nets, and language modeling for speech, and so on, from raw data. And here's an example using this other link at Google. If you put in England and France, you get back a list of countries, and it seems like a reasonably plausible list of countries. If you put in these other countries, you get another list of countries, which also seems sort of intuitively plausible. And then if you put in, say, some animals, you get back some more animals. Now, we all worked on stuff like this, but this next example is kind of interesting. If you put in cat and more, does everyone know what you're going to get back? Yes, of course you all do. Unix commands. So there was this question, should a corpus be balanced? And the answer, of course, is that the Google corpus is not balanced. It's clearly oversampled on certain topics, and especially on taboo topics. All right. At any rate, the rising tide of data lifts all boats, and I showed a couple of examples of it. The bait is to use the public web to create and socialize these new ideas. But the switch, the important thing is if you can port these ideas to data collection that we care about. So what we should be worried about is not only being able to acquire those lexical resources or to do that search, but to do it with methods that we can easily port to the next thing. So the strategy is what I said. The research papers, well, of course, there's great work here. And there's already all this interest in evaluation and all this empiricism, and I think that's great stuff. And it's all happening on these public repositories, but that we should not confuse. That's just a means towards an end. It's not the end. There should be more interest, and there will be, on how these methods port to new corpora and how performance scales with size. Right? Because we know that we're going to get more data, so the question is not how we do with the currently available data, but how are we going to work on the data that we're going to have. Hopefully size helps, but of course all the data in the world won't solve all the world's problems, and there'll be times when more data will help, and there'll be other times when it's better to do something else, like say rationalism. More recommendations for infrastructure, in addition to the traditional public repositories, like the LDC and the British National Corpus, that we ought to be thinking more about the private repositories, which are much larger. And most of us don't keep voicemail for very long, but I've been using ScanMail, Julia Hirschberg's stuff, to copy my voicemail to my email. And like a bunch of people, I keep email for a long time. So I'm now keeping a lot of voicemail.
Copy voicemail into your email.
Well, so it just means that if you call me on my audix, I will get an email message with the copy, with the audio file that you gave me, and a speech recognition transcript of what you gave me.
That's
now
what, That's what Alan Gorin talked about a little bit when he visited a few months ago.
Okay. And I think now there are a lot of commercial voicemail companies that offer you this option to email you your voicemail so it shows up in your email. And it turns out it's convenient because then I can store and forward and things like that. I can search over it. Now, the private repositories would be much larger if it were more convenient to capture the data, things like that copying of the voicemail to my email. And there were obvious value in doing so, like I could find something I wanted to find. I should add here, people ask me, how did I find those videos at the beginning of this talk? And they all assume that I had some tools like I'm talking about here. But no, I had an old boy network I called up and asked. All right? I don't know how to do better than that. All right, so currently the tools for the public repositories like Google are better than anything I have for searching my private repository. I can easily find anything I want in the public web, but to find anything in my email or my phone call records or find the videos that I want to use in these clips, I've got nothing, all right, nothing. If I had tools that were like that, then I would keep more. And if you had more search, then I would use more data, more disks. So the new priority is figuring out how to consume space. And that will mean that there's new killer apps. I'm no longer that concerned with how to get data into the system. And I really don't want help on compression. That's not part of the problem, all right? But I need something like search to consume the space. So this
need compression for search, right?
Right. And that the information theory that's behind search would be the same as the information theory behind compression. But compression isn't the reason to do it. Okay. So the summary here is that we ought to be worried about setting realistic expectations. And in the 70s, there was this hot debate between rationalism and empiricism. And people think about what they can afford to think about. Data was expensive, and only the richest industrial labs could play. It was beyond the reach of most universities. One of my advisors could dream of having an hour of speech online with annotations. In the 1990s, there was revival of empiricism. More data is better data. Everyone could afford to play. It was still expensive. Things like the Linguistic Data Consortium really helped, and that sort of then eventually the web was even better. We got all of this emphasis on evaluation, which demonstrated consistent progress over time. Maybe not as convincing as Moore's Law, but it's a pretty convincing argument. And then the data-intensive methods became the method of choice, and the pendulum swung perhaps too far. And we can ask if this is progress or if we're just about to go back the other way. And I'm suggesting that in the not too distant future, we'll have petabytes everywhere. Be careful what you ask for. And this is either going to be no problem or a huge problem. I personally am finding it hard to come up with a convincing argument how we're going to consume all that space. It's always been the case that if you build it, they will come. Although in the telephone business, you start to wonder. And right now, search, I think, is our best bet. And I think it's got a better chance of working than, say, dictation or speech compression. And video looks like really the only possible way to consume this many bits. But even that doesn't seem terribly compelling. And I can't come up with an argument for how we're going to consume petabytes per capita. But I imagine the world will figure that out. And we've still got a few years to get there. Right? So thank you. Yeah.
So I just want to say two brief things that are very much just in support of what you're saying, and then a third about a point that I think you have to pay enough attention to. So the supportive thing, one is your comments about speech Google and speech and video. The BBC, according to this month's Wired magazine, is planning to digitize and make everything available. And you know Brewster Kahle, I mean, that whole
everything they've ever broadcast.
They're going to do their best. Yeah, apparently it's a process. And you're familiar with the Malach project here. That whole area of things that you can...
Some of it's coming. I mean, for example, when you record all this stuff, maybe you could make this all available.
It's not on that scale. The second thing I want to comment on in terms of the pendulum swinging is that you're completely right. Look at the semantic web, look at FrameNet, PropBank, look at the stuff that was proposed at the most recent DARPA PI meeting about semantic annotations. That's true, and the question there is going to be, how can we use what we've learned from the empiricist side not to do the same stuff all over again? And the third thing that I think you're not paying enough attention to is that the role of unexpected adaptation. I don't think you're giving, if you build it, someone will come enough credence. If you take a look at a couple of examples, look at recommender systems, right? Paul Resnick gave a talk at MIT, basically from an economic point of view, saying nobody will ever participate in this stuff without an economic incentive. And Slashdot totally proved him wrong, so does ePinions and everything else, right? If you look at blogs and what's happening in Howard Dean's campaign, right? This unexpected thing being used for a different purpose. The internet itself, the email emerging. The key there is people. The thing that those all have in common is the Kuhn kind of argument of adaptation across a discipline, unexpected uses from one thing to another.
I might call it serendipity, right?
You can call it serendipity, but I think there are commonalities. So I think that the power of distributed people and coming of that environment, coming up with ways of having ideas emerge, is something you're not giving enough credibility to.
Well, let's hope, right?
Well, so I can give an example, right? So if you want to use lots of petabytes, I'm spinning this out on it, so this is going to be totally cookie, but what I'm going to do for kicks in 30 years, I'm going to live inside other people's skin. So they're going to capture all their data, not just what they see, but also tactile, smell, everything else. And it's going to come to me, and I'm going to feel what it's like to be there.
Well, I wish I had a video now so I could play it in 20 years.
Right?
Yeah, right. I mean, because I have a feeling it would start to sound like some of the videos I started with, right? Yeah. Was there some questions? All right.
You're looking at how much data people are going to see, and what I've seen before. What I think is interesting is what people didn't see. When somebody breaks into my house, I want to see who broke into my house and on video stored somewhere. I don't know what's going to happen, so...
Right, so you're saying this idea that I'll have a nanny cam all over the place. And there's no doubt of that. The only problem is that's really easy to compress. Because there isn't a lot of motion in your house, hopefully, when nobody's there. And also, you probably don't need DVD quality. And you're probably running... And 317 channels of this would get a little old. Yeah, but the problem is you don't need that when it's just the furniture. So you record all of that, but then you downsample when nothing happens.
You have to sign tells him to take off his mask in the middle of it. Is that it, Tom?
Okay, right. Upstairs, downstairs, right? Yeah, right. The chickens, the cat and the dog, they're chasing around. Okay, well, look, I could be all wet, right?
No, so you're going to save this video that Ken Judge saying, how are we ever going to fill up a pen?
That's right. And in 20 years, I'm going to look just as silly as those other guys, right? Yes.
At least you're not on national TV.
Not yet, right? I didn't sign a release, right?
Memory was enormous.
It seems like it's kind of a funny problem, this whole talk. I mean, or at least saying, what are we going to do to fill up a petabyte? Why? And I understand part of it is driven by where you are at AT&T. Is that really the right question to be asking?
Well, I guess
Excuse me, write the question from which list?
Yeah. So I mean, for example, I gave this talk to a bunch of accountants, and their question was, well, so who cares about the future of the tech sector, right? Right? I mean, the question should be, how does filling up a petabyte bear on making people's lives better or worse, right? And no, I'm looking at this totally self-serving. I'm trying to figure out how to keep employed.
Petabytes are cheap. I missed a logical step here. Suppose petabytes are as cheap as
watches. Right. Then
why is that going to put us all on jobs?
Then there's no profit. There's no revenues. I mean, you used to be at TI, right? You worked on watches, or you knew people who did, right?
I'll tell you that.
There's no profit.
They were very profitable for a while, weren't they?
I got a call from my father about 12 months ago, practically in tears because his entire life savings appeared to be gone. And the reason was that he had invested in, of all things, a life insurance annuity fund, which was in turn invested in telecoms. Telecom bonds, not stocks, but bonds. Nothing could be safer. And that gave me just an inkling of what I think that gives me an inkling of what you talk about. I mean, that and the overbuilding that took place in the 90s in telecom companies were.
That's right.
I mean,
And I'm trying to say that
we're
it's all overhanging this Moore's Law, keep cranking along, and that supply and demand being matched. And if one part of that equation were to disappear, things would be very different. And it's sort of up to us to try to keep that demand up. Yeah.
The question is not so much how can we store, or what can we store in a petabyte, but what is the intellectual property cost of that? Ultimately, human content is what's expensive and what takes money. And even though you can easily store the Library of Congress, you don't have rights to it. So ultimately, that's what's potentially going to be the limit, is our ability to generate novel content, not to access.
So you're saying it's the information there that's the value, not the mechanism, not the infrastructure for storing it.
Right, and our generating ability is ultimately limited by our ability to produce over a lifetime.
Now, unfortunately, for those of us working in speech and language, the value is the degree to which people care about our ability to use our stuff to get that value. And if it turns out that everybody can have everything they want, then there wouldn't be. You know what I'm saying? I mean, hopefully I'm wrong, right? All right. The other possibility is that you can figure out what's missing in this and try to create some more demand. I think search is the best argument I can come up with.
Certainly the poetic circle, since AI has been called the study of search, so you come all the way back to the beginning of your talk.
Right. And of course, the beginning of the talk was all about rationalism and the revival of it. And search is one place where it might come back. The other place it appears to be coming back is machine learning. Yeah.